It all started on a bright Saturday morning when Thomas Parker walked to his lakeside property, coffee mug in hand, expecting a calm weekend. But what he saw made him freeze mid-step. His private dock, his pride and joy, was covered in white chairs, flower garlands, and a giant banner that read "Congratulations, Chloe Ryan." At first, he thought it was some kind of joke. But then he spotted Karen Mitchell, his overbearing HOA president, barking orders at a group of decorators as if she owned the place. She was directing a small army to set up tables, a sound system, and even a cake stand on his dock. "Morning, Tom," Karen shouted without looking at him. "Hope you don't mind, we needed a prettier view for my daughter's big day." Thomas blinked, stunned. "You're kidding, right? That's my property." Karen barely glanced his way. "Relax, it's for just one afternoon. You'll thank me when the pictures go viral." The entitlement in her voice made Thomas's jaw tighten. His dock had been off limits since the HOA's constant meddling began last year, but Karen always acted like rules didn't apply to her. That morning, something inside Thomas snapped. He didn't say a word, just turned around, walked back to his house, and began planning. He didn't know it yet, but by the end of that wedding, everyone would remember that dock for a very different reason. By noon, the wedding preparations were in full swing. Guests began arriving in their polished cars, parking along Thomas's driveway as if it were part of the venue. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses echoed across the lake. Thomas sat quietly on his porch, watching the chaos unfold. His neighbor, Jim, walked over and whispered, "You're really gonna let her do this?" Thomas sipped his coffee and said softly, "Not yet." Karen strutted around in a glittering gold dress, giving orders to everyone, her daughter, the caterers, even the photographer. She treated Thomas's dock like her stage, her spotlight. When Thomas politely approached her, she rolled her eyes. "Oh, Tom, please don't ruin this day. I've already called the HOA board, and they said temporary use is allowed for community events." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Community event? This is your daughter's wedding." Karen smirked. "Same thing." That was the moment he realized reasoning was useless. She believed she was untouchable. As the sun dipped lower, Thomas walked back to his shed and opened the old toolbox his late father had left him. Inside was a coil of thick rope, a wrench, and a small utility knife. He looked at the shimmering lake, at the dock floating proudly under Karen's wedding decorations, and he smiled. Tomorrow, there would be peace again. The next afternoon, music filled the air. Guests laughed, the minister cleared his throat, and Karen's daughter Chloe looked radiant in her gown. But Thomas wasn't there to enjoy it. He was standing near the edge of the trees, watching quietly. The dock swayed gently under the weight of dozens of guests. Every decoration sparkled in the sun. It was picture perfect, almost too perfect. Karen spotted Thomas standing far back and shouted, "You can watch from there, but don't interfere." He raised a hand politely, hiding a small grin. The ceremony began. Chloe held her bouquet high, the officiant started his speech, and everyone's attention turned to the couple. That's when Thomas slowly stepped away from the crowd. Toward the dock's anchor ropes, he knelt beside the wooden post, his heart steady, his mind calm. He whispered, "Let's see how untouchable you really are, Karen." Then, with one quick motion, he loosened the knots that held the dock to the shore. No one noticed, at least not yet. The water was calm, the music loud. But inch by inch, the dock began to drift away. At first, no one realized what was happening. The photographer kept shouting directions, "Smile. Look at each other. Hold hands." But within minutes, a guest screamed, "Ah! Are we moving?" Karen spun around. Her smile vanished as she saw the gap widening between the shore and the dock. Plates began sliding, chairs tilted, and people scrambled for balance. Thomas stood calmly on shore, hands in pockets, watching the chaos unfold. Karen's voice cracked. "Stop this dock. Somebody stop it." But there was nothing to stop. It was already floating away, gracefully drifting toward the center of the lake like a giant wedding raft. The minister dropped his Bible, guests shouted in panic. And Chloe's veil flew off into the breeze. Thomas finally called out, "Looks like the wind wanted your event to go viral, Karen." Her glare could have cut through steel. "You'll pay for this, Tom," she yelled, gripping a chair for balance. He simply smiled. "You mean like how I paid for that dock?" The crowd fell silent. At that moment, the truth hit everyone: it wasn't Karen's property, it was his. Local news crews arrived the next morning. The floating wedding of Lake Pine, they called it. The video clips were everywhere, guests waving frantically as the dock drifted mid-ceremony, the bride laughing nervously, Karen yelling orders no one followed. HOA members showed up at Thomas's house, demanding an explanation. He handed them a printed copy of his property deed and a calm smile. "The dock's mine," he said. "They trespassed. I didn't touch anyone, didn't damage a thing. The wind just took it." Karen tried to argue, but the evidence was clear. The HOA had to issue a formal apology for overstepping property lines. Thomas's neighbors began stopping by with coffee and quiet high-fives. "You're a legend, man," Jim said, grinning, but Thomas wasn't proud of the chaos, just relieved that his boundary had finally been respected. Still, deep down, he couldn't deny that poetic satisfaction of watching the dock drift into the sunset. The incident spread across social media. Memes, jokes, even local news anchors couldn't stop talking about the floating wedding. Karen's reputation in the HOA crumbled overnight. People started questioning her leadership, her arrogance, her decisions. Soon after, the board voted to remove her as president. She tried to blame Thomas for everything, but it only made her look worse. Ironically, her daughter Chloe reached out to Thomas weeks later, apologizing. "My mom went too far," she said. "But honestly, that was the most memorable wedding ever." Thomas chuckled. "Glad to hear it floated your way." From that day on, no one dared to mess with his property again. The dock was repaired, reinforced, and firmly anchored with a new sign that read, "Private Dock, Weddings by Permission Only." Months later, the lake returned to its peaceful rhythm. The laughter, the arguments, and the chaos had faded, but the lesson remained. Thomas often sat at the edge of his dock, watching the sunset reflect off the calm water. He wasn't proud of humiliating anyone, but sometimes, boundaries needed to be taught the hard way. Karen eventually moved away, her ego bruised but her story famous. The HOA changed its tone: less power, more respect. For Thomas, it wasn't revenge. It was balance, and whenever new neighbors asked about the floating wedding story, he'd smile, sip his coffee, and say, "Let's just say the wind had good timing." And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.